The sound of steel cable tearing through wet wood is distinct, a high-pitched shriek that vibrates through the bone. It is the sound of a last chance evaporating. 60 feet below the surface, in the suffocating dark of a Texas pit, a man named Jim Beiel hung suspended by a fragile collection of ropes and prayers. He had already survived the impossible. He had plummeted 65 feet down a jagged limestone shaft, smashed onto a rock floor and lived. He was conscious, he was talking, and he was about to be saved. But the physics of the underworld are unforgiving, and human error is the most dangerous variable of all. As the rescuers pulled, hoisting him toward the circle of light above, the rope frayed. The wooden backboard, splintering under the strain, gave way. Gravity reclaimed its debt. Jim fell again, screaming back into the abyss, a victim not of the cave but of the rescue. This is the terrifying reality of underground exploration. The environment is trying to kill you, but sometimes, it is the people trying to save you who seal your fate. On February 28, 1976, the landscape near Fair Oaks Ranch, Texas, was dry and desolate. To the untrained eye, the hole in the ground looked like nothing more than a slit in the earth, barely wide enough for a dog to crawl through. But to 6 amateur explorers, it was the promise of discovery. They were not cavers in the traditional sense. They were adventurers without the requisite discipline, men driven by curiosity rather than competence. None of them had vertical training. None of them understood the mechanics of anchor loads or the tensile strength of hemp. They were armed with flashlights and a naive bravado, walking into a vertical world without a map. When they peered over the edge, they saw a void dropping 60 feet into darkness. Their solution was as crude as it was dangerous. A homemade rope ladder, constructed by hand, thrown over the edge to rattle against the rock. The descent into a pit is a sensory deprivation exercise. The light from the surface fades from white to gray to blue, and finally to a suffocating black. The smell of the earth changes, becoming metallic and damp. The temperature drops, chilling the sweat on your back. One member of the group climbed down first, testing the integrity of their makeshift bridge. He reached the bottom and found another chamber, but there was a horrifying realization waiting there. The floor of the first room was actually a shelf over a second pit. This one dropped another 50 feet into the unknown. The ladder they had brought only reached 10 feet down into the second drop. They were 60 feet underground, staring at another 50-foot void, with equipment that was barely holding together. It was a dead end, but the adrenaline of the moment pushed them forward. Jim Beiel, 27 years old, decided to descend. Jim was young, strong, and fueled by the invincibility of youth. He made a series of decisions that would prove fatal within minutes. He went down without a helmet, stripping himself of the most basic defense against falling rock. He went down without a harness, removing his ability to be secured by a rope. He carried only a flashlight, his lifeline to the visible world. There was no belay system, no safety rope above him to catch a fall. He trusted the ladder. It was a trust based on hope, not engineering. He climbed down into the second drop. He was about 15 feet from the top when the physics of the situation turned against him. A rung on the homemade ladder snapped. It wasn't a dramatic break, just a sudden loss of support. Jim's grip faltered. He didn't just fall. He tumbled, his body striking the chamber floor 60 feet below. But the momentum carried him forward. He rolled, helpless, over the edge of the second pit. He fell 50 feet in free fall. In total, he had dropped 65 feet onto solid rock. The impact should have killed him instantly. The human body is not designed to absorb that kind of kinetic energy. Miraculously, Jim was alive. When his friends reached the edge of the second pit, shining their lights down, they saw him moving. He was conscious. He was talking. But the injuries were catastrophic. He had multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and severe trauma. The adrenaline was keeping him alive, masking the horror of his physiology. The group was paralyzed. They had no equipment to reach him, no stretcher, no medical gear. They were 6 amateurs standing on a ledge, helpless. They ran to the surface and called for help. An hour and a half later, the rescue team arrived. They brought a medic, a stretcher, and the heavy gear of professional rescue. It seemed like the nightmare was ending. It had just begun. The medic rappelled down to Jim. He found him drifting in and out of consciousness, his body battered, his pulse thready. They made the decision to move him. They strapped him to a wooden backboard, securing his body with ropes and a steel cable lifting strap. It was a standard procedure for the time, but it ignored a critical medical reality. Jim was hypovolemic from internal bleeding. His blood volume was crashing. In a vertical lift, gravity pulls the remaining blood away from the brain and pools it in the legs. To survive a vertical lift with massive internal bleeding, You need pressure infusion, fluids, and speed. They had none of the first, and the second was impossible in a narrow shaft. As they began to haul him up, hand over hand, the strain on the equipment became immense. The stretcher rose 50 feet, clearing the second pit, moving toward the first ledge. But then it caught. The stretcher snagged on the lip of the pit, a jagged edge of limestone that acted like a blade. The rescuers on the surface didn't realize the angle was wrong. They kept pulling. They put their backs into it, hauling against the snag. The tension spiked. The rope, stressed beyond its limit, began to fray. Fibers popped, singing in the tension. And then the steel cable gave way. It didn't break, it cut. It sliced through the wooden backboard as if it were soft cheese. The restraint holding Jim failed. He fell. He dropped 50 feet again, plummeting back into the darkness. The impact that had injured him the first time killed him the second. He died in the dark, surrounded by the people who had fought so hard to save him, a victim of a rescue that ignored the biomechanics of the dying body. It was a tragedy of errors, a cascade of poor decisions starting with a homemade ladder and ending with a snapped rope. The cave didn't kill Jim Beiel. The incompetence of man did. But death in the underground comes in many forms. Sometimes it is violent and sudden, a snap of bone or a fray of rope. Other times, it is slow, quiet, and psychological. It is the death of hope in absolute darkness. In Thailand, in the limestone karsts of Chakra Mountain, the caves are not just geological features. They are factories of resources. Bora was a guano collector. His job was to descend into the hot, suffocating depths of the earth to harvest bat droppings, a valuable fertilizer. It was grueling, filthy work, but it was his livelihood. He knew these caves, or at least he thought he did. On what was supposed to be a routine 3-day expedition, Bora prepared for the physical toll. He packed a flashlight, water, dried rice, and empty cloth sacks. His destination was a roost 1,200 feet deep, a massive cathedral of darkness where millions of bats swarmed. The descent was a journey through a claustrophobic nightmare, a 2-mile labyrinth of tight squeezes and vertical drops. Bora moved with the efficiency of a man who has done this 1,000 times. He navigated the narrow passages, crawling on hands and knees, the smell of ammonia from the bat guano stinging his eyes and lungs. The air was thick, heavy, and hot. He reached a section of the cave known for its difficulty, a passage that required belly crawling through a fissure in the rock. The walls were polished smooth by centuries of water flow, slick as glass. The narrowest point was a mere 6 inches wide, a vertical drop into nothingness that had to be traversed with extreme care. Bora paused, his heart rate steady. He shifted his weight. And then the mistake happened. It wasn't a fall. It was a fumble. His flashlight, his only connection to the visual world, slipped from his grasp. It didn't shatter, it slid. It hit the smooth rock and vanished into the 6-inch crevice, falling into the void below. In an instant, Bora was blinded. The darkness of a cave is not like the darkness of a bedroom. It is absolute. It is a physical weight pressing against the eyes. Without the light, the brain begins to scream for input. Panic is the instinctive reaction, the primitive urge to thrash against the dark. But Bora tried to fight it. He needed that light. It was his tool, his job, his lifeline. Without thinking, without calculating the risk, he lay prone on the slick limestone and reached into the crevice. He felt the smooth walls, the cold dampness. He stretched further, shifting his center of gravity over the drop. He couldn't feel the light. He leaned deeper, extending his arm to the shoulder. And then gravity took control. The slick walls offered no friction. He slipped. He didn't fall far, only a few feet, but he fell perfectly into the trap. The crevice was a constrictor. Bora slid headfirst into the V-shaped notch. His shoulders hit the narrowing walls and jammed. His chest was compressed, his arms pinned uselessly above his head or against his sides. His legs were dangling in the void above him, kicking at nothing. He was wedged tight. The physics of the trap were terrifying. The more he pushed down with his legs to try to gain leverage, the tighter his shoulders locked into the constriction. The more he exhaled to make himself smaller, the deeper he slipped. He was corked in the rock, unable to move up, unable to move down. He was alone in the absolute dark, buried alive in a coffin of stone. The first hours were a struggle of pure adrenaline. Bora fought. He clawed at the rock with his fingertips, tearing his nails, scraping his skin raw. He twisted his hips, trying to create friction, trying to wriggle free. He screamed until his throat was raw, knowing that the rock swallowed sound as easily as it swallowed light. But the cave didn't yield. It held him in a grip of cold, indifferent stone. As the hours bled into a day, the adrenaline faded, replaced by a cold, creeping realization. He was stuck. Truly deeply stuck. The thirst set in first. The cave air was dry, sucking the moisture from his breath. His lips cracked. His tongue felt like sandpaper. Without his flashlight, he had no concept of time. The darkness played tricks on his mind. He heard footsteps that weren't there. He felt the walls breathing, closing in on him. By the second day, the physical pain was overshadowed by the psychological torture. The isolation of a cave is total. You are severed from the rhythm of the world. There is no sun, no wind, no sound of life other than your own wet, ragged breathing. Bora was dehydrating rapidly. His muscles began to cramp, knotting in his contorted position. The lack of circulation caused his limbs to go numb, then to burn with pins and needles. He was trapped in a paradox of pain and numbness, unable to find a single position of relief. The darkness became a mental enemy. It whispered to him. It told him he would never be found. It told him he was already dead. The silence was so loud it rang in his ears. He thought of his family. He thought of the sun. He thought of the futility of reaching for a flashlight. By the third day, the horror transcended the physical. Bora descended into a state of delirium. The human mind is not designed to process nothingness for that long. Hallucinations flickered in the blackness. He saw faces in the rock. He heard voices calling his name. The despair was absolute, a heavy blanket that suffocated his will. He seriously considered suicide. It was a rational calculation born of madness. A slow death of dehydration and suffocation in the dark seemed infinitely worse than a quick end. He thought about throwing himself backward, letting gravity take him down the shaft to a broken neck. But the fear of the unknown below, the fear of a prolonged death in the dark, paralyzed him. He just hung there, weeping tears that immediately soaked into the dirt around his eyes, a statue of misery carved from flesh and stone. On the surface, the world had moved on until it hadn't. Bora was expected back. When he didn't return, his brother knew something was wrong. He organized a search party. It was a needle in a haystack, searching miles of dark, twisting tunnels for a man who didn't have a light. They moved methodically, calling his name, shining lights into every crack. They were 1,000 feet deep, miles from the entrance, when they heard it. It wasn't a scream. It was a faint, pathetic cry, so weak it could have been the wind. They followed the sound to the crevice. When their flashlights finally cut through the darkness and illuminated Bora, the sight was horrifying. He was wedged like a cork, covered in dust and excrement, pale as a ghost, barely responsive. He had been there for 4 days. He had survived without water, without food, without movement, in a state of terror that would break most men in 4 hours. The rescue was a logistical nightmare. They couldn't just pull him out. The crevice was too tight. Pulling might dislodge him, sending him falling down the shaft, or it might crush his ribcage. They had to bring him out the way he went in, but expanded. Over 200 rescuers assembled, a human chain operating in the stifling heat. The operation was surgical. They brought in hand tools, chisels and hammers. They had to widen the crevice, breaking away the limestone that held him, millimeter by millimeter. They had to be incredibly careful. One wrong strike, one rock shifted too aggressively, and the whole wall could collapse, crushing him or causing a cave-in. Medical personnel weaved 4 lines through the rocks to hydrate him, trying to stabilize a body that was shutting down. 4 hours, the sound of tapping on rock echoed in the chamber. Bora drifted in and out of consciousness, feeling the vibrations of the rescue through the stone that held him. The psychological toll didn't end when the light came back. The fear that the rock would shift, that the rescue would fail, that he would die with freedom inches away was paralyzing. The rescuers worked in shifts, sweating, exhausted, terrified of making a mistake. Slowly, agonizingly, the constrictor loosened. The space widened by 1 inch. Then 2. Finally, after 4 days and 17 hours of trapping, they were able to get a harness around him. With a coordination of strength and tenderness, they pulled. The rock released its grip. Bora slid free. He was carried out on a stretcher, blinking in the alien brightness of his headlamps, a man reborn from the womb of the earth. These 2 incidents, separated by decades and continents, tell the same story. The underground does not negotiate. In Texas, 6 men underestimated the verticality of the world and the fragility of their equipment, leading to a rescue that became a second execution. In Thailand, a single man made a split-second decision to reach for a light, and spent 4 days paying the price in the dark. The common thread is the thin line between survival and catastrophe. A ladder rung breaks. A flashlight slips. A rope frays. In the world above, these are inconveniences. In the world below, they are the end. The cave is indifferent to your experience, your plans, or your desperation. It is a place of absolute physics and absolute darkness. To enter it is to accept that you are small, fragile, and temporary. And sometimes, no matter how hard you fight or how many people come to save you, the mountain keeps what it takes. The darkness waits, patient and eternal, for the next mistake.